so glad to welcome you here into the Joyful House. Glad that you have stopped by, and thank you for coming to Once Upon a Storybook. Today we are continuing to read book number 6, Anne of Ingleside. And if you are ready, join me as we read chapters 7 and 8. So sit back, relax, and let the story adventure begin. Chapter 7. He'll have plenty of company. He won't be lonesome. Our 4 and my niece and nephew from Montreal are visiting us. What one doesn't think of, the others do. Big, sonsy, jolly Mrs. Dr. Parker smiled expansively at Walter, who returned the smile somewhat aloofly. He wasn't altogether sure he liked Mrs. Parker in spite of her smiles and her jollity. There was too much of her somehow. Dr. Parker he did like. As for our 4 and the niece and nephew from Montreal, Walter had never seen any of them. Lowbridge, where the Parkers live, were 6 miles from the Glen, and Walter had never been there, though Dr. and Mrs. Parker and Dr. and Mrs. Blythe visited back and forth frequently. Dr. Parker and Dad were great friends, though Walter had a feeling now and again that Mother could have gotten along very well without Mrs. Parker. Even at 6, Walter, as Anne realized, could see things that other children could not. Walter was not sure either that he really wanted to go to Lowbridge. Some visits were splendid. A trip to Avonlea now? Ah, that was fun for you. And a night spent with Kenneth Ford at the old House of Dreams was more fun still. Though that couldn't really be called visiting, for the House of Dreams always seemed like a second home to the small fry of Ingleside. But to go to Lowbridge for 2 whole weeks among strangers, now that was a very different matter. However, it seemed to be a settled thing. For some reason which Walter felt but could not understand, Dad and Mummy were pleased over the arrangement. Did they want to get rid of all their children? Walter wondered, rather sadly and uneasily. Jim was away, having been taken to Avonlea 2 days ago, and he had heard Susan making mysterious remarks about sending the twins to Mrs. Marshall Elliott when the time came. What time? Aunt Mary Maria seemed very gloomily over something, and had not been known to say what she wished it was all well over. What was it she wished over? Walter had no idea, but there was something strange in the air at Ingleside. "I'll take him over tomorrow," said Gilbert. "The youngsters will be looking forward to it," said Mrs. Parker. "It's very kind of you, I'm sure," said Anne. "It's all for the best, no doubt," Susan told the shrimp darkly in the kitchen. "It is very obliging of Mrs. Parker to take Walter off our hands, Annie," said Aunt Mary Maria, when the Parkers had gone. "She told me she had taken quite a fancy to him. People do take such odd fancies, don't they? Well, perhaps now for at least 2 weeks I'll be able to go into the bathroom without tramping on a dead fish." "A dead fish, Auntie? You don't mean—" "I mean exactly what I say, Annie. I always do. A dead fish. Did you ever step on a dead fish with your bare feet?" "No, but how?" "Walter caught a trout last night and put it in the bathtub to keep it alive, Mrs. Dr. dear," said Susan airily. "If it had stayed there, it would have been all right, but somehow it got out and died in the night, of course, if people will go about on bare feet." "I'll make it a rule never to quarrel with anyone," said Auntie Mary Maria, getting up and leaving the room. I am determined she shall not vex me, Mrs. Dr. dear," said Susan. "Oh, Susan, she is getting on my nerves a bit, but of course I wouldn't mind so much when all this is over, and it must be nasty to tramp on a dead fish." "Isn't a dead fish better than a live one, Mummy?" "A dead fish wouldn't squirm," said Di. Since the truth must be told at all costs, it must be admitted that the mistress and maid of Ingleside both giggled. So that was that, but Anne wondered to Gilbert that night if Walter would be quite happy at Lowbridge. "He's so very sensitive, and imaginative, she said wistfully. Too much so, said Gilbert, who was tired after having had to quote Susan 3 babies that day. Why, Anne, I believe that child is afraid to go upstairs in the dark. It will do him worlds of good to give and take with the Parker Fry for a few days. He'll come home a different child. Anne said nothing more. No doubt Gilbert was quite right. Walter was lonesome without Jim, and in view of what happened when Shirley was born, it would be just as well for Susan to have as little on her hands as possible beyond running the house and enduring Aunt Mary Maria, whose 2 weeks had already stretched to 4. Walter was lying awake in his bed trying to escape from the haunting thought that he was going to go away next day by giving free rein to fancy. Walter had a very vivid imagination. It was to him a great white charger, like the one in the picture on the wall, on which he could gallop backward or forward in time and space. The night was coming down, night like a tall, dark, bat-wing angel who lived in Mr. Andrew Taylor's woods on the South Hill. Sometimes Walter welcomed her. Sometimes he pictured her so vividly that he grew afraid of her. Walter dramatized and personified everything in his small world. The wind who told him stories at night, the frost that nipped the flowers in the garden, the dew that fell so silverly and silently, the moon which he felt sure he could catch if he could only go to the top of that faraway purple hill. And the mist that came in from the sea, the great sea itself that was always changing and never changed. The dark, mysterious tide. They were all entities to Walter. Ingleside and the Hollow and the Maple Grove and the marsh and the harbor shore were full of elves and kelpies and dryads and mermaids and goblins. The black plaster of Paris cat on the library mantelpiece was a fairy witch. It came alive at night and prowled around the house, grown to enormous size. Walter ducked his head under the bedclothes and shivered. He was always scaring himself with his own fancies. Perhaps Aunt Mary Maria was right when she said he was far too nervous and high-strung, though Susan would never forgive her for it. Perhaps Aunt Kitty McGregor of the Upper Glen, who was reported to have the second sight, was right when, having once taken a deep look into Walter's long-lashed, smoky gray eyes, she said, "He did be having an old soul in a young body." It might be that the old soul knew too much for the young brain to understand always. Walter was told in the morning that Dad would take him to Lowbridge after dinner. He said nothing, but during dinner a choky sensation came over him, and he dropped his eyes quickly to hide a sudden mist of tears. Not quickly enough, however. "You're not going to cry, Walter," said Aunt Mary Maria, as if a 6-year-old mite would be disgraced forever if he cried. "If there's anything I do despise, it's a crybaby, and you haven't even eaten your meat." "All but the fat," said Walter, blinking violently, but not yet daring to look up. "I don't like fat." "When I was a child," said Aunt Mary Maria, "I was not allowed to have likes and dislikes. Well, Mrs. Dr. Parker will probably cure you of some of your notions. She was a Winter, I think. Or was she a Clark? No, she must have been a Campbell. But the Winters and the Campbells are all tarred with the same brush, and they don't put up with any nonsense." "Oh, please, Aunt Mary Maria, don't frighten Walter about his visit to Lowbridge," said Anne, a little spark kindling far down in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Annie," said Aunt Mary Maria, with a great humility. "I should, of course, have remembered that I have no right to try to teach your children anything." "Drat her hide," muttered Susan, as she went out for the dessert, Walter's favorite queen pudding. Anne felt miserably guilty. Gilbert had shot her a slightly reproachful glance, as if to imply she might have been more patient with a poor lonely old lady. Gilbert himself was feeling a bit seedy. The truth, as everyone knew, was that he had been terribly overworked all summer, and perhaps Aunt Mary Maria was more of a strain than he would admit. Anne made up her mind that in the fall, if all was well, she would pack him off wilful-nilly for a month's snipe shooting in Nova Scotia. "How is your tea?" she asked Aunt Mary Maria repentantly. Aunt Mary Maria pursed her lips. Too weak, but it doesn't matter. Who cares whether a poor old woman gets her tea to her liking or not? Some folks, however, think I'm real good company. Whatever the connection between Aunt Mary Maria's two sentences was, Anne felt she was beyond fretting it out just then. She had turned very pale. I think I'll go upstairs and lie down, she said, a trifle faintly, as she rose from the table. And I think, Gilbert, perhaps you better not stay long in Lowbridge, and suppose you give Miss Carson a ring. She kissed Walter goodbye rather casually and hurriedly, very much as if she were not thinking about him at all. Walter would not cry. Aunt Mary Maria kissed him on the forehead. Walter hated to be moistly kissed on the forehead, and said, Mind your table manners at Lowbridge, Walter. Mind you ain't greedy, and if you are, a big black man will come along with a big black bag to pop naughty children into. Well, that's horrible. It was perhaps as well that Gilbert had gone out to harness Grey Tom and did not hear this. He and Anne had always made a point of never frightening their children with such ideas or allowing anyone else to do it. Susan did hear it, and she cleared the table, and Aunt Mary Maria never knew what a narrow escape she had of having that gravy boat and its contents flung at her head. Chapter 8. Generally, Walter enjoyed a drive with Dad. He loved beauty, and the roads around Glen Street Mary were beautiful. The road to Lowbridge was a double ribbon of dancing buttercups, with here and there the ferny green rim of an inviting grove. But today Dad didn't seem to want to talk much, and he drove Grey Tom as Walter never remembered seeing him driven before. And when they reached Lowbridge, he said a few hurried words aside to Mrs. Parker and rushed out without bidding Walter goodbye. Walter had again hard work to keep from crying. It was only too plain that nobody loved him. Mother and Father used to, but they didn't any longer. The big, untidy Parker house at Lowbridge did not seem friendly to Walter, but perhaps no house would have seemed that just then. Miss Parker took him out to her backyard with shrieks of noisy mirth were resounding, and introduced him to the children who seemed to fill it. Then she promptly went back to her sewing, leaving them to get acquainted by themselves, a proceeding that worked very well in 9 cases out of 10. Perhaps she could not be blamed for failing to see that little Walter Blythe was the 10th. She liked him. Her own children were jolly little tads. Fred and Opal were inclined to put on Montreal airs, but she felt quite sure they wouldn't be unkind to anyone. Everything would go swimmingly. She was so glad she could help poor Anne Blythe out, even if it was only by taking one of her children off her hands. Mrs. Parker hoped all would go well. Anne's friends were a good deal more worried over her than she was over herself, reminding each other of Shirley's birth. A sudden hush had fallen over the backyard, a yard which ran off into a big Bowery apple orchard. Walter stood looking gravely and shyly at the Parker children and their Johnson cousins from Montreal. Bill Parker was 10, a ruddy round-faced urchin who took after his mother and seemed very old and big in Walter's eyes. Andy Parker was 9, and Lowbridge children could have told you that he was the nasty Parker one, and was nicknamed Pig for reasons good. Walter did not like his looks from the first. His short-cropped fair bristles, his impish freckled face, his bulging blue eyes. Fred Johnson was Bill's age, and Walter didn't like him either, though he was a good-looking chap with tawny curls and black eyes. His 9-year-old sister, Opal, had curls and black eyes, too. Snapping black eyes. She stood with her arm around tow-headed 8-year-old Cora Parker, and they had both looked Walter over condescendingly. If it had not been for Alice Parker, Walter might, very conceivably, have turned and fled. Alice was 7. Alice had the loveliest little ripples of golden curls all over her head. Alice had eyes as blue and soft as the violets in the hollow. Alice had pink dimpled cheeks, and Alice wore a little frilled yellow dress in which she looked like a dancing buttercup. Alice smiled at him as if she had known him all her life. Alice was a friend. Fred opened the conversation. "Hello, Sonny," he said condescendingly. Walter felt the condensation at once and retreated into himself. "My name is Walter," he said distinctly. Fred turned to the others with a well-done air of amazement. He'd show this country lad. "He says his name is Walter," he told Bill with a comical twist of his mouth. "He says his name is Walter," Bill told Opal in turn. "He says his name is Walter," Opal told the delighted Andy. "He says his name is Walter," Andy told Cora. "He says his name is Walter," Cora giggled to Alice. Alice said nothing. She just looked admiringly at Walter, and her look enabled him to bear up when all the rest chanted together, "He says his name is Walter," and then burst into shrieks of derisive laughter. "What fun the dear little folks are having," thought Mrs. Parker, complacently over her shearing. "I heard Mom say you believe in fairies," Andy said, leering impudently. Walter gazed levelly at him. He was not going to be down before Alice. "There are fairies," he said stoutly. "There ain't," said Andy. "There are," said Walter. "He says there are fairies," Andy told Fred. "He says there are fairies," Fred told Bill. And they went through the whole performance again. It was torture to Walter, who had never been made fun of before, and he couldn't take it. He bit his lip to keep the tears back. He must not cry before Alice. "How would you like to be pinched black and blue?" demanded Andy, who had made up his mind that Walter was a sissy and that it would be good fun to tease him. "Pig, hush," ordered Alice terribly, very terribly, although very quietly and sweetly and gently. There was something in her tone that even Andy dared not flout. "Course I didn't mean it," he muttered shamefactedly. The wind veered a bit in Walter's favor, and they had a fairly amicable game of tag in the orchard. But when they trooped noisily into the supper, Walter was again overwhelmed with homesickness. It was so terrible that for one awful moment he was afraid he was going to cry before them all, even Alice, who, however, gave his arm such a friendly little nudge as they sat down that it helped him. But he could not eat anything. He simply could not. Miss Parker, for whose methods there was certainly something to be said, did not worry him about it, comfortably concluding that his appetite would be better in the morning, and the others were too much occupied in eating and talking to take much notice of him. Walter wondered why the whole family shouted so at each other, ignorant of the fact that they had not yet had time to get out of the habit since the recent death of a very deaf and sensitive old grandmother. The noise made his head ache. Oh, at home now they would be eating supper too. Mother would be smiling from the head of the table. Father would be joking with the twins. Susan would be pouring cream into Shirley's mug of milk, and Nan would be sneaking tidbits to the shrimp. Even Aunt Mary Maria, as part of the home circle, seemed suddenly invested with a soft, tender radiance. Who would have rung the Chinese gong for supper? It was his week to do it, and Jim was away. If he could only find a place to cry in. But there seemed to be no place where you could indulge in tears at Lowbridge. Besides, there was Alice. Walter gulped down a whole glassful of ice water and found that it helped. "Our cat takes fits," Andy said suddenly, kicking him under the table. "So does ours," said Walter. The shrimp had had 2 fits, and he wasn't going to have the Lowbridge cats rated higher than the Ingleside cats. "I'll bet our cat takes fittier fits than yours," taunted Andy. "I bet she doesn't," retorted Walter. Now, don't let any arguments over your cat," said Mrs. Parker, who wanted a quiet evening to write her institute paper on misunderstood children. "Run out and play. It won't be long before your bedtime." Bedtime? Walter suddenly realized that he had to stay here all night. Many nights. 2 weeks of nights. It was dreadful. He went out to the orchard with clenched fists to find Bill and Andy in a furious clinch on the grass, kicking, clawing, and yelling. "You give me the wormy apple, Bill Parker," Andy was howling. "I'll teach you to give me wormy apples. I'll bite off your ears." Fights of this sort were an everyday occurrence with the Parkers. Mrs. Parker held that it didn't hurt boys to fight. She said they got a lot of devilment out of their systems that way, and they were as good as friends as ever afterwards. But Walter had never seen anyone fight before and was aghast. Fred was cheering them on. Opal and Coral were laughing, but there were tears in Alice's eyes. Walter could not endure that. He hurled himself between the combatants, who had drawn apart for a moment to snatch breath before joining battle again. "You stop fighting," said Walter. "You're scaring Alice." Bill and Andy stared at him in amazement for a moment, until the funny sight of this baby interfering in their fight struck them. Both burst into laughter, and Bill slapped him on the back. "It's got spunk, kids," he said. "It's going to be a real boy sometime if you let it grow. Here's an apple for it, and no worms either." Alice wiped the tears away from her soft pink cheeks and looked so adoringly at Walter that Fred didn't like it. Of course, Alice was only a baby, but even babies had no business to be looking adoringly at other boys when he, Fred Johnson of Montreal, was around. This must be dealt with. Fred had been into the house and had heard Aunt Jen, who had been talking over the telephone, say something to Uncle Dick. "Your mother's awful sick," he told Walter. She isn't," cried Walter. "She is too. I heard Aunt Jen telling Uncle Dick." Fred had heard his aunt say, "Anne Blythe is sick, and it was fun to tack it in the awful. She'll likely be dead before you get home." Walter looked around with tormented eyes. Again Alice ranged herself by him, and again the rest gathered around the standard of Fred. They felt something alien after this dark, handsome child. They felt an urge to tease him. "If she is sick," said Walter, "Father will cure her." "He would. He must." "I'm afraid that will be impossible," said Fred, pulling a long face, but winking at Andy. "Nothing is impossible for Father," insisted Walter loyally. "Why, Russ Carter went into Charlottetown just for a day last summer, and when he came home his mother was dead as a doornail," said Bill. "And buried," said Andy, thinking to add an extra dramatic touch. Whether a fact or not didn't matter. "Russ was awful mad he'd missed the funeral. Funerals are so jolly." "And I've never even seen a single funeral," said Opal sadly. "Well, there'll be lots of chances for you yet," said Andy. "But you see, even Dad couldn't keep Mrs. Carter alive, and he's a lot better doctor than your father." "He isn't." "Yes, he is, and a lot better looking, too." "He isn't." "Something always happens when you go away from home," says Opal. "What will you feel like if you find Ingleside burned down when you go home?" "If your mother dies, likely you children will all be separated," said Cora cheerfully. "Maybe you'll come and live here." "Yes, do," said Alice sweetly. "Oh, his father wouldn't want to keep him," said Bill. "He'd soon be marrying again, but maybe his father will die too. I heard Dad say Dr. Blythe was working himself to death. Look at him staring. You got girl's eyes, Sonny. Girl's eyes. Girl's eyes." "Aw, shut up," said Opal, suddenly tiring of the sport. "You ain't fooling him. He knows you're only teasing. Let's go down to the park and watch the baseball game. Walter and Alice can stay here. We can't have kids tagging after us everywhere." Walter was not sorry to see them go. Neither, apparently, was Alice. They sat down on an apple log and looked shyly and contentedly at each other's. "I'll show you how to play jackstone," said Alice, "and lend you my plush kangaroo." When bedtime came, Walter found himself put into the little hall bedroom alone. Mrs. Parker considerately left a candle with him and a warm puff for the July night was unreasonably cold, as even a summer night in the Maritimes sometimes is. It almost seemed as if there might be a frost. But Walter could not sleep, not even with Alice's plush kangaroo cuddled to his cheek. Oh, if he were only home in his own room, where the big window looked out on the glen and the little window with a tiny roof all its own looked onto the Scotch pine. Mother would come in and read poetry to him in her lovely voice. I'm a big boy, and I won't cry. I won't." The tears came in spite of himself. What good were plush kangaroos? It seemed years since he had left home. Presently the other children came back from the park and crowded amiably into the room to sit on the bed and eat apples. "You been crying, baby," jeered Andy. "You're nothing but a sweet little girl, Mama's pet." Have a bite, kid, said Bill, proffering a half-gnawed apple. And cheer up. I wouldn't be surprised if your mother got better. If she's got a constitution, that is. Dad says Mrs. Stephen Flagg would have died years if she hadn't had a constitution. Has your mother got one? Of course she has, says Walter. He had no idea what a constitution was, but if Miss Stephen Flagg had one, Mother must. Mrs. Ab Sawyer died last week, and Sam Clark's mother died the week before, said Andy. They died in the night, said Cora. Mother says people mostly die in the night. I hope I won't. Fancy going to heaven in your nightdress. Children, children, get off to your beds, called Mrs. Parker. The boys went, after pretending to smother Walter with a towel. After all, they rather liked the kid. Walter caught Opal's hand as she turned away. Opal, it isn't true Mother's sick, is it? He whispered imploringly. He would not face being left alone with his fear. Opal was not as bad-hearted child as Mrs. Parker said, but she could not resist the thrill one got out of telling bad news. She is sick, and Aunt Jen says so. She says I wasn't to tell you, but I think you ought to know. Maybe she has cancer. Does everybody have to die, Opal? This was a new and dreadful idea to Walter, who had never thought about death before. Of course, silly. Only they don't die really. They go to heaven, said Opal cheerfully. Not all of them, said Andy, who was listening outside the door, in a pig's whisper. Is heaven farther away than Charlottetown? Asked Walter. Opal shrilled with laughter. Well, you are queer. Heaven is millions of miles away. But I'll tell you what to do. You pray. Praying is good. I lost a dime once, and I prayed and I found a quarter. That's how I know. Opal Johnson, did you hear what I said? And put out that candle in Walter's room. I'm afraid of fire, called Mrs. Parker from her room. He should have been asleep a long time ago. Opal blew out the candle and flew. Aunt Jen was easy going, but when she did get riled, Andy stuck his head in the door for a good night benediction. Likely them birds in the wallpaper will come alive and pick your eyes out, he hissed. After which everybody did really go to bed, feeling that it was the end of a perfect day, and Walt Blythe wasn't a bad little kid, and they'd have some more fun teasing him tomorrow. Dear little souls, thought Mrs. Parker sentimentally. An unwanted quiet descended upon the Parker house, and 6 miles away at Ingleside, little Bertha Marilla Blythe was blinking round hazel eyes at the happy faces around her and the world into which she had just been ushered on the coldest July night the Maritimes had experienced in 87 years. Well, thank you for joining me for this storybook adventure. I hope you are enjoying this, poor little Walter. And thank goodness that we realized that Anne is really not like deathly sick. She is just having a baby. Well, I look forward to seeing you next time. Be joyful and find your joy, live your joy, and I'll see you next week. Bye.